I'd like to welcome you to this webinar. The chat is off. Ask questions through question and answer, the Q&A piece. And I would like to introduce to you Melinda Frame right now, who will take it away.
Hi, thank you, Donna. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Melinda Frame. I'm a member of the League of Women Voters in the Lansing area. I'd like to welcome you today on this gray and rainy day. Today's community forum is gun violence, how research guides policy. So last year in 2020, over 43,000 people in the United States were killed by gun violence. An additional 39,000 people were injured by gun violence in the US. So unfortunately, reports of gun violence are all too common in our daily news. So it's clear that gun violence is a significant issue to the public's health and safety. So for today's forum, we are very pleased to welcome with us Dr. April Zeoli. She's an associate professor in the School of Criminal Justice at Michigan State University, and Carol Seaman, the Ingham County prosecutor. So both speakers today will review some of the current research that's being conducted into gun violence in the United States, and they will discuss how gun violence research can directly influence actions and policies that our communities and legislators can take to help reduce gun violence and its effect on our community. So each of our speakers will provide just a short overview of some of their work and experiences, and then we'll take questions. So if you have questions that you would like to ask April or Carol, please submit them. Please use the Q&A, the question and answer box that's present in the Zoom menu. We'll take those questions at the end. So our first speaker, as I mentioned, is Dr. April Zeoli. April's main field of investigation in the School of Criminal Justice is the prevention of gun violence, of intimate partner violence, and homicide through the use of policy and the law. She's one of the nation's leading experts on policy interventions for firearm use and intimate partner violence. And she's expanded her research around the impact of firearm policies on childhood firearm injuries and deaths. So April, welcome.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having me. I want to really focus in on that question. How can gun violence research directly influence actions and policies that our communities and our legislators can take to help reduce gun violence and its effect on the community? Now, as Melinda mentioned, my research is generally around intimate partner homicide and firearm laws. And about 3 or 4 years ago, I did a study that found that these domestic violence restraining order firearm restrictions are associated with reductions in homicide at the community level, intimate partner homicide at the community level. And just to clue people in, for those who may not know, in some states and under federal law, if you are under a domestic violence restraining order, certain type of domestic violence restraining order, you cannot purchase or possess a gun. Now, states vary in their approach to this law. So in some states, you have to be a spouse, current or former, or have a child with, or cohabitated with the person the restraining order is against to get that firearm restriction. And in some states, there is a law that says that if you're restricted from having a gun, then a judge can or shall order you to relinquish any guns you already possess. So we looked at I and my team looked at those specific provisions in our research. We wanted to know if extending the restriction to dating partners and requiring relinquishment of guns already possessed was important to the law. Were those provisions decreasing homicide, intimate partner homicide, above and beyond the firearm restriction for just the spouses and without relinquishment? And we found that those provisions were important. We saw a 13% reduction in total intimate partner homicide when a state said that the restrictions could be placed on dating partners. And we saw a 12% reduction in total homicide when a state said that a judge could or shall impose a relinquishment order on the respondent to the firearm restriction. So that research was pretty big news. And we were able to get the dating partner extension into the Violence Against Women Act. So the one that was, first introduced in 2019 and is not yet passed, we were able to get that dating partner provision into the Violence Against Women Act so that if and when it is passed, dating partners may, under federal law, be prevented from having access to guns if they're under a domestic violence restraining order that carries, that can carry a firearm restriction. So that's one example. Another example is from 2 weeks ago, I think. The state of Colorado was considering a relinquishment law for their domestic violence restraining order firearm restriction law. And I was asked to participate in the hearing. And, due to us all being on Zoom these days, I could comfortably participate and testify while I'm in Michigan. So that's what I did. And I sat through about 2 hours of discussion and then other people's testimonies on this relinquishment law. And, you hear both sides. Heard that, some people were very pro passing this relinquishment law. They believed it would keep intimate partners safer. Other people were not for it for various reasons. And there was one state legislator who asked after every person's testimony, do you have statistics? Can you tell me with statistics whether this law would make any difference at all? And everybody before me said, no, I don't know the numbers. I can just, I can tell you about my experience because there were a lot of practitioners and people who had been abused by their partners testifying. And I sat there like, oh, coach, put me in, because I really wanted to address this question. That question was for me. And when it was my turn and I testified, I laid it all out. I laid the research out. I laid the statistics out. And so answered all of the questions this legislator had been asking during the hearing. And when it was time for questions to me, all he wanted to know was where could he find the study, because everything else had been answered. And this bill passed out of committee. It was a committee hearing. It passed out of committee about an hour later. So we can have a great effect on policy, but you have to do policy-focused research. And that's the type of research that I do. I wanted to just mention 3 projects that I have going on that are all designed to inform policy after they're done. And the first is a study of intimate partner homicide. So in 6 states, Oregon, Missouri, Texas, Maryland, New Jersey, and Arizona, I and my team are collecting intimate partner homicide cases. We're getting information on them through police departments, through coroners' offices, and we will be talking to people who were close to those who were killed. And we're also talking to people who have been partner abused, non-fatally, obviously. And we're using both of these groups to compare what is different. So what makes it more likely that intimate partner violence will end in a homicide? And that's what we're going to look at. This study was actually is actually an update of a study that came out in 2003 that found that gun access was the big driver of intimate partner homicides. You've probably heard the statistic: when a violent intimate has access to a gun, his female partner is 5 times more likely to be killed, or he is 5 times more likely to kill his female partner than if he didn't have access to a gun. It comes from that study, and we're updating it, and we're updating it with an eye on the laws that are in place in that state to reduce batterers' access to guns, and looking at whether the perpetrators were prevented from having guns or restricted, I should say, from having guns through domestic violence restraining orders, through criminal convictions, and whether that might have played a role in the homicide. We don't know what we'll find. We're just starting to collect that data now. So we'll see. The next project is somewhat similar, but focuses more on non-fatal gun violence in intimate partner violence. And that project I'm really excited about. I'm excited about all of them, but this one is just starting up, and that's the very exciting phase. We're looking in Michigan and in Wisconsin at people who have petitioned for protective orders, domestic violence protective orders. In Michigan, we call them PPOs. In Wisconsin, they call them domestic abuse restraining orders. And we're looking for people, I probably said this, who have had gun-involved intimate partner violence. And we're going to interview them around the time of them petitioning for the order. And we're going to interview them again 6 months later. And what we want to know is, whether they got that restraining order, whether that restraining order carried firearm restrictions, and whether, if the abuser had access to a gun, that access was removed. In other words, the gun was relinquished or removed by law enforcement. Because we're interested in seeing whether that removal, whether that prevention of access is influential in whether or not there's future gun violence. And that includes threats. So we really want to see, does this law, do these mechanisms prevent gun violence on an individual level? Do they prevent the risk or reduce the risk to the person who's getting the restraining order? And Michigan and Wisconsin are interesting to look at together because Wisconsin has a relinquishment law. Michigan doesn't. Wisconsin's domestic violence firearm restriction is mandatory. Michigan's is discretionary, though there is the federal law in place. So there are some key differences that we hope to take advantage of to really get the answer to our question. And that will help us tell the legislators what's going on. So if we find that actual relinquishment of firearms reduces the risk to the PPO petitioner, we can take that to the legislators, to the legislators here in Michigan and say, look, this appears to reduce the risk. We don't have this law in Michigan. Would you like to consider it? Please consider, whether this might work for Michigan. If we find out that the firearm restriction isn't even being implemented. So people aren't getting the firearm restriction in Michigan when they have, or Wisconsin, when they have these gun-involved intimate partner violence cases. Then we can take that to the communities that we're working in. Maybe there's gun violence that followed after they didn't get the firearm restriction. We can inform our communities of what is going on and, hopefully help them chart a path to keep people safer. And the third project, I just saw one of the questions, where can we find the study that April did supporting her research? I'll send it to Donna, and she can distribute it however these things get distributed. The third study is of extreme risk protection orders. We don't have this in Michigan. What this is, a lot of people call them red flag laws. I don't like the term red flag laws because it tends to bring up mental health connotations. Extreme risk protection orders are a civil court mechanism. So if there is someone who is in imminent risk of harming themselves or harming others, a law enforcement officer, or in some states, a family member, can go to the civil court and petition for an extreme risk protection order that, if granted, would temporarily remove their ability to purchase and possess a gun. And it should include relinquishment. And these laws are really pretty new. Only 4 states had them before 2015. And so there's not a whole lot of research on them. And we want to know everything. How are people using this? Are they being granted? Do they actually reduce future violence? So in this study, I'm again looking at 6 states: California, Colorado, Connecticut, Florida, Maryland, and Washington. And we're gathering all the extreme risk protection orders, petitions in these states, and looking at why people are petitioning for them. So what risk factors are they listing? Is it mostly suicidal risk factors? Is it mostly violence against others? Is there drug involvement? The whole picture. And then looking at what is influential in them being granted or denied. And we're looking at whether they're associated with suicide risk. And that study is going to inform legislators in all states. The 6 states that we're working in all have slightly different laws, and we're looking at the differences between these laws, in addition to the other things I've listed. For example, Florida doesn't allow family members to petition. California does. Maybe we'll find something interesting that suggests that family members are an important group to have petition because they know more about the person than law enforcement does. Or maybe we'll find that law enforcement is really the group that is putting in the petitions that are most successful, and they're really the group you want to have petitioning. We don't know. We're in the early stages of this, but again, this will all inform is a better word than influence. This will all inform legislators. There are 2 other questions. Do you look into the factors of gender and their influence on intimate partner violence? Yes and no. I'm not really sure what factors of gender might be, but we definitely look at gender. Though it can be very difficult because really most of the victims are women and most of the perpetrators are men. So there's not a whole lot of variation, though there is some. And then people from outside the US often express disbelief or exasperation with Americans and our apparent tolerance of gun ownership and violence in our country. how do we help them understand the cultural significance of firearms and the difficulty of changing those attitudes? Yeah, I think people outside the US often understand that they are culturally significant to us, though they may not understand why. So maybe that's your question. You know, I don't do culture stuff. Yeah, I would just have them watch a video. But the difficulty of changing those attitudes, it is actually not as difficult. There is almost a false narrative of a great divide in this country over guns. There is an extreme group. There's a very, very vocal, very extreme group who doesn't, want restrictions on guns, virtually any. And then there are groups on the other side who really don't want anybody to have a gun. So those are much less vocal and very, very small, a very, very, very small segment. But most people, especially when we do polls, scientific research polls of people's positions on gun policies, most people are on the same page. Do you support background checks for everybody who is going to buy a gun? In other words, when they're going to a private seller. Now we have that in Michigan, but many states don't. Everybody says yes. Do you support laws that would remove guns from perpetrators of domestic violence? Most everybody says yes. So I like to think more of the togetherness we have than the divide, for lack of a better way to say it. And I'm a couple minutes over, so I'm gonna, we can take the rest of the questions later. But thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you so much, April, for sharing some of your research with us. And I'm sure we will have more questions to come. So, all right. So our next speaker is Carol Seaman. She is Ingham County's prosecuting attorney. Carol served over 11 years as assistant Ingham County prosecutor before being elected in 2016 and then reelected in 2020 to be the Ingham County prosecutor. As the Ingham County prosecutor, Carol is the chief law enforcement officer official for Ingham County. Throughout her career, Carol has been focused on promoting options that would help protect our community. She's also been focused on using research and data to help transform our local justice system. So Carol, thanks again for joining us today.
Thank you. So in between those 11 years as an assistant prosecutor and coming back as the elected prosecutor was 22 years where I did a lot of other things. During that time, I started the Child Abuse Training Program through the Prosecuting Attorneys Association for CPS workers, prosecutors, and police officers, which still exists. I also drafted legislation for the Legislative Service Bureau. I wasn't a policy person there. I was just like kind of the person who puts the words to paper. I worked at the Children's Ombudsman's Office. I worked at the MSU School of Social Work, the State Court Administrative Office, Department of Health and Human Services, and Public Policy Associates. Really the focus over the last, say, 25 years of my career has been in a couple different areas: child welfare, juvenile justice, racism, and the intersection of all of these issues and training. My belief when I left the prosecutor's office in 1995 was it was important to have a statewide focus. I was discouraged by system response. I still am, but that was, so I thought I'll address that is by going to the state level. And so today, when we're talking about gun violence prevention, one of my favorite topics, it really intersects with everything else. Because in my mind, you don't have a safe and thriving community that is low in gun violence without also addressing all the other social woes. And so there's this intersection of poverty and racism and jobs and how we value or don't value our children and what we provide in terms of healthcare, daycare, all those things. So I first came to prosecution because I was doing volunteer work with Council Against Domestic Assault in the early 1980s, which is evolved into the Ending Violent Encounters, or EVE. And I didn't see myself as being a prosecutor, but I saw that victims weren't being well represented in the system. So that's what initially drew me to the system. And now, coming back all these years later to try to take what I've learned at the state level and national level, and from researchers like Dr. Zeoli and so many others, is that we need to use that to drive our policy. Prosecutors are inherently pretty reactive. We're always way too busy and too much to do. And to sit down and thoughtfully develop policy is very difficult, frankly. So when we have experts we can draw upon, it's very, very helpful. For example, Dr. Zeoli alluded to what the research she's doing and what has been shown about intimate partner violence. When I first came to the prosecutor's office, there was a late 1970s, maybe 79 study in Minneapolis, Minnesota, that showed that if the police simply responded and actually took the DV perpetrator from the home, made an arrest, that reduced violence, not just against that individual victim, but all violence in Minneapolis. So when I came on board, that was like one of my first big things, because domestic violence at that time was not treated very seriously. Police officers often just had the guy walk around the block, cool down period. It wasn't really treated seriously. Then when we started treating it more seriously, it was a real punitive way. And that theme is going to keep coming back up. So if you were a mother who was abused, it was quite likely that CPS would get involved and maybe remove your children for failure to protect. Or there were other things that went on that really focused, like so many other things, focused the blame for the behavior of someone else on the woman. So that's been kind of one of my ongoing concerns as well. So as the pandemic has impacted so many parts of our society and everybody, it's shown the light on some of the biggest flaws in our system, and they've really the chasms have grown larger. So the racial disproportionalities, poverty issues have been shown by the COVID deaths, who was most impacted. It also has been shown by the increase in gun violence. So we've had a dramatic increase in gun violence and homicides, not all gun violence. I'll talk about that in a second, here in Ingham County. But we're not at all alone. It's going on pretty much every place. And it really is, I think, as you add the stressors, the coping mechanisms just no longer are enough. And all the friction is made more intense. So we know child abuse is also going up, but we don't have a lot of data on that because, for example, children are in school, right? So we don't know everything that's going on. Domestic violence, there are a lot of victims early in the pandemic who really were focused on just like they knew they were stuck in the same place with this perpetrator. So they were just doing what they needed to do to get by and survive. So they weren't like, this wasn't a great time to leave and to retake legal action. So there's a lot of domestic violence that was going unaddressed because the victims were engaged in self-protective behavior, something that made sense in those circumstances. We've seen a rise in youth having guns. We've seen a rise in youth being killed, which is particularly troubling to me. So there's an intuitive response, and I'm seeing it again. I'm old. I've been a lawyer for 40 years, and so I saw. I'm as old as you guys because you're my demographic. What I've seen in the 80s and 90s is starting to happen again, and I want to nip it in the bud as much as I can locally. And that is, whenever you have a rise in violence, you have a get tough on crime response. And with guns, what that involves is a police focus in trying to get guns off the street. Now, while I'm not a fan of guns and frankly would push a button and make them all disappear if I could, what we've learned is, number one, just literally getting guns off the street does not make the community more safe. It also almost always is going to disproportionately impact certain communities. So Black and brown communities are just going to be policed more intensely, more traffic stops, Even though guns and sometimes drugs or other contraband are removed, it's not necessarily, in fact, research has said just getting those guns off the street is not linked to a reduction in gun violence. Now, what some of the things that April talked about are, so, and she'll find out more, and that'll be really great. So when we target who shouldn't have a gun, and while I don't think anybody should, really, but when we target who really shouldn't have a gun, we want to look at people where we have extreme protection orders. There was legislation introduced in 2017 in Michigan. I don't know that it was reintroduced in this current session. But we know that if we have really targeted responses, they just work better than this kind of generic, let's just stop lots of people, mostly Black and brown, and we'll probably get some guns, which is true, they do. But it doesn't make the community safer. And it also really creates a lot of community anxiety, right? And fear, because with what's been going on, there's a significant legitimate fear that a traffic stop can result in injury or death. And so I think it's more important to look beneath of why do so many people feel they need to carry guns? And sometimes it's, being macho or whatever, but a lot of times people carry guns because they feel a legitimate need to keep themselves safe. They're really literally carrying the gun, not planning to be a perpetrator, but planning, they feel they need it for protection because maybe they've experienced a trauma like watching one of their close friends shot in a drive-by shooting, or they've been shot themselves. I mean, it's really shocking to those of us. For me, for example, as a white middle-class woman who has never been shot, or had a gun pointed at me, to realize the level of trauma so many people if nonchalantly can talk about because it's just part of what they've experienced. So when we're looking at how we address gun violence, it's really important, I think, to have a multi-pronged approach. And part of that is I'd like to just see outright ban on ordinary people carrying assault rifles. I'd like to see stronger relinquishment laws and ability to limit who can get access to firearms. Obviously, where and how people can carry firearms, open carry and taking guns in the Capitol and all that. It's just so frightening. I mean, it's so frightening for me to see someone walking around with an assault rifle. It just intimidates me, and they're not looking at me with any hostility. So I imagine what it must feel like for people who really are in fear. So legislation and policy changes, at that level are really critical. And then I'm a big fan of the idea of violence interruption and using the community and using people with what's called lived experience, people who maybe have been involved in gun violence, maybe themselves have committed crimes, maybe not charged, maybe charged. Almost every community of any size has about 30 to 40 people who are identified as the real drivers of violence in that community. We have about 35 of them here. We know who they are, right? And that's one reason the police make a lot of stops. But what if you instead have a violence interruption mentality that says the community actually leverages the experiences and skills of these and the networks, the community connections of these individuals, and has them be credible messengers back to the other community members as negotiators to de-escalate situations. So there are many violence interruption programs. There's ceasefire, cure violence. The model that we are now going to be participating in is called Advanced Peace. And they all have some certain similarities. Advanced Peace has several unique things. One is that the developer actually grew up in Lansing, Michigan. And during his first development of this in Richmond, California, his brother was actually murdered here. And that was a real crisis for him where he had to decide, do I move forward or do I go to the dark side, basically. And what he did was he moved forward. And so Richmond, California was the first site. And there's a lot of robust data now about Richmond, Stockton, Fresno, and Advanced Peace is growing throughout the US. The other part that's unique about Advanced Peace is that some of the others, like I think Ceasefire and Cure Violence, both have a component where they actually work with law enforcement. And Advanced Peace does not. It's not hostile to, but it's basically saying if we're going to have a community-driven response. There's such distrust towards the police and the prosecution and the court system. And by the way, I know that legally I'm the chief law enforcement official, but I think I have a different role, and I don't see myself as a law enforcement official. I really see myself in a different role. But it's a role that, even though I'm very committed to this process, I've had to back away. So now every 2 weeks, Advanced Peace has stakeholder meetings, and I'm not participating in those because even though I'm very committed to it, having the prosecutor there can have a chilling effect on the process. So I have to let that go and just say, I trust that our community is going to put together the pieces so that this will really work. And what happens is there are actually mentors or fellows who work directly with individuals in the community. They provide that networking. They are kind of, it's more than a big brother, but it's so multifaceted. And it's worked very well other places. And I certainly hope it will work really well here, also. I guess the biggest thing is I really want to move away from just being punitive. There's times, I believe in holding people accountable, and that includes jail and prison, probation, certainly relinquishing firearms, but we move to punitive right away. And so I'm trying to, and we know that when we are punitive, it almost always disproportionately impacts marginalized communities. And that can range from somebody who has autism or a disability. LGBTQ population are terribly marginalized in the criminal legal system. And certainly, women were also often victims, and yet it's not consistent or fair how much burden is placed on the women to basically, take care of themselves. The system doesn't do it as well as it could. So what was I going to say? So what I've been trying to gather data since I started as the prosecutor, and learned that our case management system, like most prosecutors across the nation, allows us to track individual cases beautifully, but does not allow us to pull out data to develop themes. So I have been looking at ways to do that. I've been working with Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation Project, which is the Kellogg Foundation project through our One Love Global here in Lansing. And we put together our own data spreadsheet, but haven't had staff to actually do the data entry. Was trying very, very hard for a couple of years to get involvement from the Vera Institute. And finally, just over a year ago, they took us on for technical assistance to do a dive under what Reshaping Prosecution project, which it looks at mass incarceration through a race equity lens. But then shortly after, we were selected to be one of the partners in that, and that's been an ongoing process. They've had partners 3 communities a year since about 2016 or 17. But they also have started a brand new endeavor called Motion and Justice. And that's more specifically focusing on race equity issues. And they asked us to be one of the 3 initial partners on that. So I think it's Boulder, Colorado, Minnesota, there's a jurisdiction, Ramsey County, Minnesota, and us, I think, are the ones now. But what that is acknowledging that as we've started to get initial data, we've realized, like, since I've been in office, reduced incarceration to prison by 18%, the proportion of Black persons is still had been at the same, which is about 40%. Now, our community has about 14%, our county, of Black individuals. And so therefore, the 40% prison commitment rate is, very concerning. It's also very consistent with what goes on other places. But this is my county, so I'm very concerned about what we can do to reduce it. And Motion and Justice is not just to reduce mass incarceration, but also to look at the reasons why, even when we're reducing incarceration rates, the racial disproportionality is still almost identical. And that's true almost everywhere. So that means we have to look deeper. And that's one of the things the Vera Institute is going to help us to do. And even though I'm not a researcher or evaluator, I have great trust in it. I like to make decisions based on evidence and research. So one thing that I'm going to be implementing a number of policies in the near future that are going to try to reduce the kinds of contacts police have. So basically saying, listen, for these certain kinds of things, just don't stop people, in the car or on the street. If you do, we're going to look at any warrant request with a very heightened scrutiny. And, not if you do certain things, we're just not going to issue charges. And because we don't want these kinds of contacts that are so troubling to be ones that we're having here in Ingham County. So that's one thing I'm doing. Another is I'm particularly concerned about a study that came out in, I think, December from Safe and Just Michigan that looked at a particular charge, felony firearm. Now, there are many, many different kinds of gun, weapons charges in Michigan, either city ordinances or state law and federal law too. So this one in particular was enacted in 1976. It was issued to deal with Detroit. And it's a mandatory minimum of 2 years in prison. So most charges, there's a sentencing range based on your prior background, criminal background, and the particular offense you're involved in, where there are multiple victims, was a victim a child, things like that we want to be considered in sentencing. But with felony firearm, it is just a straight up 2 year prison. And it's consecutive. So if you get any other prison time, you have to serve that 2 years in prison, then your other sentence. And what we found is, number one, it doesn't reduce crime, and number two, pretty much uniformly in counties that have Black persons and brown persons, which not every county in Michigan has many, but in the larger counties like ours, hugely disproportionately impacts Black people. So for example, out of Ingham County, 90% of the people incarcerated solely for felony firearm, which means they had another felony, but that got dismissed, and they're serving the sentence just on felony firearm, 2 years, are Black. Okay, 90%. And our statistics are very consistent with, Detroit and Genesee and Saginaw. I don't remember the other counties, but the big 10 counties. So I'm going to be, I've been looking at this. I think I'm going to just tell my staff we're not issuing felony firearm anymore. We'll do there are many other firearm and statutes we can use, but let's not use one that we found to be really overtly racist. So that's what I'm looking at. I'm trying to say, let's really do a more focused approach on who is driving the violence, whether it's domestic violence or child abuse or, the drive-by shootings and the, gun violence we're seeing really prevalent right now. What things can really directly impact that? And let's target the individuals, not in a let's just go pull people over and pull off guns. But let's really look at what kinds of things work and keep the community safer. And to do that, and this, I think I will end because I know we're running out of time. I think that it's really critical to keep the community involved at each level. And it's an extremely complicated thing to do because it's not like there's the community. There are many different communities. This is a community here. And I'm meeting with a lot of people specifically about trying to address what policy changes we should make in my office. And it's a long, drawn out process. And I miss, it's not there's not a magic, like you press a button and now you have all the community members and you can come together and have these discussions and kumbaya, we're all on the same page. It's not at all. But those voices are really important. And no matter whether it's driving legislation or policy changes by police or prosecutors or courts, it's really critical to get that voice involved in a meaningful way. Because I came up, I'm a lawyer, I'm a white woman, I'm educated. I'm just, was kind of used to telling people what to do in a nice way, but telling people what to do, giving them lots of advice. And to pull back and say, I really have to listen and learn what other people's priorities are and not just assume I know what the right thing to do is. So it's been one of my opportunities to grow and to try to design policy and practices here in Ingham County that really are designed to keep people safe.
Well, thank you so much, Carol. It was great to hear about all of the work that you are doing here in the community. So I think for the remainder of the time, we'll kind of address a few of the questions that we had. Both of you emphasized so much about how important statistics and research into gun violence, into the community, how important that is when generating policy. So I wondered if you could both talk maybe a little bit about funding. I think, over the years, there's been a limitation on federal funding. Is that funding easing up? Maybe April, you could address this. Is funding becoming more available? Is it mostly private foundations that are doing this? Who supports this type of research? It's so important.
Yeah, so since the mid to late 1990s, gun violence prevention research has not been funded to the levels it needs to be. There have been some studies funded by the National Institute of Justice, but they don't have a whole lot of money to give to researchers. So it's been 1 or 2 studies a year. And then private foundations have provided the other source of funding dollars, mainly the Joyce Foundation, which is located in Illinois and has funded some of my research. A couple of years ago, mainly after the mass shooting in Parkland, at the high school in Parkland, federal funding and foundation funding for gun violence prevention research opened up. There's an organization called the National Collaboration for Gun Violence Research that has a 5-year commitment to funding gun violence research. They're in year 3 right now. But they have funded, I believe it's about $25 million worth of gun violence research. And 2 of the studies that I mentioned, the intimate partner homicide and the extreme risk protection order studies, are both funded by the National Collaboration for Gun Violence Research. And the National Institutes of Justice and the CDC, the National Institutes of Health and the CDC have both gotten, pots of money to fund gun violence research. About $25 million is on the table this year, I think. And so there has been more funding. The federal funding, it looks like from what they funded last year that they're trying to stay away from policy research. Studies that are absolutely needed about, factors that go into gun violence and how to prevent gun violence at the community level, that stuff is getting funded. But the policy analyses right now are not getting funded. But, that's okay. We need all of the research. So we are seeing research now, more research than there has been possibly ever. I don't know what it looked like in the 80s, but we certainly didn't have a lot of research coming out. So I'm very encouraged, but we still don't have enough. We don't have enough funding given the scope of the problem. The number of people who are non-fatally wounded and killed by firearms every year demands that we have even greater amounts of funding.
Carol?
So I'm, of course, very pleased to see the CDC is finally looking at gun violence. I think most of us intuitively or actually know that gun violence is a public health issue, but yet there's been such a resistance. So knowing that this is a nonpartisan entity, I'm a Democrat, but I think just we can agree that whatever one's political affiliations are, this is a different administration in Washington. So already we've just applied for a grant that was one that it's innovations in prosecution. It's actually not going to fund anything in our office, ironically. I was hoping to get an anti-violence prosecutor who actually would not be our traditional gun violence, domestic violence prosecutor, but really one who could look at the situation more holistically. And although, because we look at things in this narrow, and we have to manage, right, the data, you have to say domestic violence, intimate partner violence, this. Same with child abuse or guns on the street. We look at them narrowly, but I wanted someone to be across the board who's really looking at issues in violence in the community. That we're not going to get that, but we did write the grant that actually will support the evaluation and a sustainability of some data collection issues with Michigan Public Health Institute for the Advanced Peace program. So when we get that in place, then this will be supportive of that endeavor. It won't be based in our office. It'll just kind of a pass through. But one thing I'm optimistic about is I do think that there's going to be funding. Now I'm program oriented or intervention oriented. So what I think there'll be money coming down for law enforcement, for looking at some innovative practices, alternatives, hopefully for the community, because really one of the discussions we've been having is that when do we get police out of things? The police, I'm not an abolished police person by any stretch of the imagination, but I do believe that there are places where having other people involved is just more prudent. It really reduces the tensions and it gives better service to people. So I'm hoping there'll be funding that can go directly to community organizations to be developing those alternatives. First, giving people restorative justice, sexual assault intervention, we have, good domestic violence intervention, but not robust enough. And really trying to keep more people out of the criminal legal system. So I think we're really running out of time, so I'm going to quit. But so funding for me means something different than funding for April, but I think we're both aiming in the same direction.
Right. Well, I had wondered the same thing. Several weeks ago, President Biden issued several executive actions, and one of them, I believe, had to do with funding for anti-violence programs. And I wondered if that kind of funding would funnel down into the Michigan or Lansing area. Does Michigan or Lansing, are we already supporting those kind of anti-violence programs, or are we funding, are we lacking funding? So I just wondered how easy would it be for a group like Advanced Peace to be able to get set up and have actions here in the Lansing area?
Well, Public Health Department was looking at cure violence for years before I basically said, well, cure violence isn't moving along real fast for us. Maybe we should look at Advanced Peace instead. And one of the biggest challenges is that you have to, cobble together pockets of money. So the Ingham County Board of Commissioners really early on said, listen, we're really committed to this. We think this is important in our community. We got a little pocket of money through some involvement we have with Project Safe Neighborhoods, something I'm involved with through the U.S. District Attorney's Office. City of Lansing was a little slower coming on board, but I think what did happen was when the federal funding pandemic response money came in, and that's like over $50 million for the City of Lansing, about $50 million for the county. It took away the economic pressure, right? And so now in Mayor Shore's budget, there's money for Advanced Peace. As like I said, I'm working on funding that'll help with the evaluation process. We also have had some domestic violence. We have a domestic violence attorney that's paid for to focus solely on domestic violence. That is a grant. I can't remember. I think it's VOCA, the victims of crime. I don't think we have it through VAWA. We have some money through the Violence Against Women, but there'll be hopefully new sources.
All right. Well, before we run out of time, we did want to try to get to some of the questions that have come in from our attendees. So we have Linda Melangari with us and Marty Correttis. Linda, do we have some questions that you would like to relay?
Yes, there's one on March 24th, the United States Supreme Court heard arguments regarding when police can enter a citizen's home. A man asked his wife to kill him and put him out of his misery. The woman called the police and said her husband was suicidal. What are the ramifications for ERPO laws depending on what the Supreme Court decides? Possibly April?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with exactly what was at legal issue in that case. Do you know, Carol?
Well, I'm not really familiar with that exact situation, but we have Fourth Amendment search and seizure issues, including being in your own home. And we also know, we watched the Breonna Taylor situation. So one of the biggest questions is when should it be police who respond, especially if it's a mental health issue or it's a substance use disorder or some other issue, a family situation that maybe you're really looking for someone who's very highly trained in de-escalation and, being able to get someone into appropriate services or a family member to safety. And when you have police come, even really well-trained, we do have great crisis intervention team trained officers in the Lansing area. It helps de-escalate things tremendously. But when you have people with a gun coming into a home, it escalates things intrinsically. So if we can look for other alternatives that reduce when police really do have to be involved, that's ideal for me.
Yeah, but it sounds like this would be a case where an extreme risk protection order, could be warranted. Now, we hope that extreme risk protection orders are kind of the tool of last resort. Try everything else, try getting that person into mental health services. If it is a mental health, issue, suicide often is, try to have a person voluntarily give up their guns, whatever. If it's a criminal issue, try to go through the criminal justice system. In this circumstance, what I'm hearing at least, is that we have a person who wants to die and is trying to make that happen. And if that person isn't going to, voluntarily have lethal means removed from their home, then it might be time to go to a civil court and get those lethal means removed.
What if the ERPO laws are weakened by the Supreme Court decision?
I guess I have a hard time understanding how that would be.
Yeah.
If it were Fourth Amendment protection against unreasonable search and seizure, if someone is suicidal and doesn't want you coming into your home, how can someone who's at risk get recourse for safety?
So the ERPO, it isn't something that police officers can just do in the moment. It is an order granted by a judge.
Yeah.
There is a process.
Yeah, and so it depends what the circumstances are, whether it's a Fourth Amendment search and seizure. So if we're talking about I'm in the house and there's somebody who I think is going to kill themselves, my teenage son or something, I can consent to the police coming into the house. The question is if it's my teenage son, I don't have a teenage son, but lives, in an apartment across town, police can't just burst in. So.
Thank you.
We have any additional questions?
I think that's it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, kind of following along, talking about the extreme risk protection orders, I just had a quick question about, let's see, I've kind of lost my thoughts here. So there's many states that already have these types of ERPO or red flag laws. But here in Michigan, we have the protection order. Once those get issued, who becomes essentially the victim advocate? Who makes sure that that it gets into the court system, that the law enforcement carries out what they're doing? Who advocates for the victim once that's done?
It really depends. I will say that, so what happens in Ingham County, at least pre-pandemic, was that Barb Byram, our county clerk, would send a letter because when we used to have carrying pistol licenses, concealed pistol licenses, CPLs, or CCW permits rather, there was a gun board of which I would have been a member because the elected prosecutor is. And then, but the county clerk has certain functions. So one of hers will be just send a letter out that says, you have to relinquish this gun. Now, sometimes the sheriff's department, and again, I don't know what's happening during the pandemic, has actually done some sweeps where they've, people who have not, some people voluntarily turn them in when they're told they have to. Most, many don't. So sometimes the sheriff department has gone out and they've had, fairly decent luck, but it's really, and April might know more about how it works elsewhere. It's really catch can. It's not uniform at all. And sometimes, for example, a domestic violence homicide that occurred the Joanne Fabrics, which was Eaton County, but just barely. Or was that Ingham County? That was Ingham County, just barely. It was on the other side of Waverly. But there was an Eaton County order, and they'd actually had a gun had been relinquished. But he was able to go and go to Total Firearms and should not have been able to, and he walked out, he stole one from them. So, nothing's perfect, but he didn't legally have access at that point.
All right, well, it looks like we're just about out of time. So thanks so much. I really appreciate you both, Carol Seaman and April Zioli, for spending time with us today. I realize you guys have such a busy schedule. We appreciate your time. And thanks to everyone that joined us today for this great community forum. I just wanted to mention that many of you know that the League of Women Voters is known for promoting citizen participation, often through voting, but of course we also work to educate citizens on topics like these. If you want to learn more about the League, I encourage you to visit lwvlansing.org, and we'll try to, this has been taped, so we'll try to get this up on YouTube so that you can view the seminar. So thanks again to everyone for joining us today. We appreciate your time.